The story begins with NASA astronauts conducting research on Mars at a site called Acidalia Planitia. They were collecting soil samples when they suddenly received a message that a dangerous and massive storm was rapidly approaching. Upon receiving this message, Johnson immediately summoned the commander and the rest of the team inside the HAB. They learned that the storm was about to hit their MAV with a force of 86,000 newtons. The MAV, or Mars Ascent Vehicle, is a rocket that lifts astronauts from the surface of Mars to their spacecraft orbiting Mars. However, maintaining the MAV's upright position was crucial. If the MAV overturned in the storm, they would be stranded on Mars forever. The situation was so serious that there was little time for reflection. The commander immediately decided to abort the mission and return to Earth. She then began to move toward the MAV with her team following her. But unfortunately, by then, the storm had intensified and the situation was steadily worsening. As soon as the commander opened the airlock of the HAB, a strong gust of wind swept inside, crippling his steps. Loosening HABs. But somehow the commander composed herself and, with her team, began moving towards the MAV. The 5 astronauts had barely reached the halfway point when a broken antenna from their HAB struck Mark Watney. The HAB struck Mark Watney, sending him flying like a straw lost in the fierce storm. Just then, Martinez received a signal on his computer indicating an oxygen leak from Mark's spacesuit. This sent shockwaves through Mark's crew. If all the oxygen in his spacesuit were exhausted, he would die within seconds. Realizing this, the commander and his team desperately searched for Mark. But even seeing each other in the fierce storm was nearly impossible. They were connected only by signal, and their connection with Mark was completely lost. Ultimately, they failed to find him. Meanwhile, the MAV was tilting steadily. Commander Sun was left for a moment, but she knew that the lives of others could not be risked for one. So Beck assumed that, without oxygen, Marg would have left this world by now. Hearing this, the commander returned to the MAV with tears in her eyes. Before the MAV could completely capsize, she gave the order to launch, and they all departed for Earth, carrying the burden of Mark's death in their hearts. But the next morning, when the terrible storm on Mars subsides, it is discovered that Mark Watney is still alive. The antenna wire had pierced his suit, penetrating his body. But blood and the wire combined to maintain the pressure in his suit and prevent oxygen from leaking, saving his life. When he opens his eyes, he finds himself completely alone, far away from the HAB. He understood that everyone else had left the scene last night to escape the storm. Mark didn't make the foolish decision of removing the rod. Instead, he disconnected it from the antenna dish and, enduring the pain, managed to reach the HAB. The air pressure inside the HAB was normal. Mark immediately threw off his spacesuit and, in one swift movement, pulled the rod out from his stomach. His agonizing scream echoed throughout the HAB, but a small piece of the antenna was still stuck in his stomach. Mark managed to remove it with the help of a first aid kit and stitched his wound with a stapler. The unbearable pain had shaken Mark's mind. But this was just the beginning. The real troubles for Mark were about to begin as he was stranded completely alone in the rugged desert of Mars. The dish that Mark had hit was a communications satellite dish, which was now completely destroyed. Because of this, Mark couldn't contact his teammates or NASA. Even if he were lucky enough to get in touch with NASA, it would take NASA at least 4 years to deliver any help to Mars. The HAB in which Mark felt safe was designed to last only 31 days. If the oxygen system failed before that, Mark would suffocate to death. If the water reclaimer failed, he would die of thirst. But even if, by some miracle, the HAB lasted longer and no accident occurred, Mark still didn't have enough food to survive for 4 years. Now, this thought filled. He recorded all this in his computer journal and finally sat down awaiting death. For the next 2 days. Meanwhile, Mark was haunted by the fear of death. He now understood that he was certain to die there as he lacked sufficient food and water and no way to contact NASA. He resolved, I'm not going to just die on Mars without trying. So devised a survival plan that he had planned to wait for NASA's Eris 4 mission, and when it arrived, he would return with it. However, the Eris 4 mission was still 4 years away from launch, and he needed food to survive that long. He began to make a list of the food he had, including the food for Mark and his companions. He had only enough left to last him for about a year, but he had to survive for 4 years. Seeing this, Mark was at a loss as to what to do. Then his eyes fell on potatoes, and an idea struck him. Consequently, he made the bold decision to start farming on this barren land of Mars. He has some potatoes available, and plans to grow them on these very potatoes. But to make the soil fertile, he'll need a lot of water, and there's no water on Mars. No water on Mars. Mark is a professional botanist, so he knows exactly what's required to grow crops. He now sets about preparing to start farming on Mars. Botany first collects a large amount of soil and transforms it into a field. To make the soil fertile, Mark brings in human waste, astronaut feces, which has a very unpleasant odor. But Mark endures this and prepares fertilizer from it. Then he splits the potatoes into 2 pieces and plants them in the soil with the fertilizer so they can grow. But now he needs to prepare water. Fortunately, Mark knows how to make water. Water is produced by burning hydrogen and oxygen. He has all the necessary tools to do this. The first time he mixes hydrogen with oxygen, a massive explosion occurs because he didn't calculate the amount of oxygen in the room, which is constantly being exhaled through his breath. However, the next time he successfully mixes hydrogen and oxygen in the correct proportions and burns them, water begins to form. This process causes evaporation, forming tiny droplets of water. The soil receives the required amount of water. After a few days, the first plant sprouts, bringing Mark immense joy. Meanwhile, on Earth, NASA informs the media that Mark Watney is no more. This news spreads like wildfire throughout the world, and a funeral is held. The next day, Vincent arrives at the NASA office and asks the NASA director to divert the satellite to mission Eris 3. Director Teddy refuses, saying that doing so would expose Watney's body to the world. This could have tarnished NASA's image and hampered funding for future missions. But Vincent wasn't about to give up. He sent the coordinates of the Eris 3 mission area to Mindy Park. Mindy is a satellite expert. When the satellite camera was pointed at the coordinates, Mindy was astonished. She saw that their equipment had been moved, and the rover had also been removed from its place. This convinced her that Mark was still alive. She immediately called Vincent, the head of the Mars program, and explained the situation. Vincent also shared this information with NASA Director Teddy Sanders. The director tried to dismiss it by saying it might have been caused by a storm, but Vincent told him that the solar panels had also been cleaned. Seeing this, the director also became convinced that Mark was not dead and was still alive. This news leaves them perplexed, as news of Mark's death has spread worldwide and his funeral has already taken place. How will NASA announce to the media that Mark Watney is still alive? They all decide to share this news with the media, but the rest of the crew returning to Earth on Hermes will not be informed so as not to upset them or feel guilty about leaving Mark to die on Mars. Meanwhile, Mark had been stranded on Mars for 70 days. By now, he had arranged for food and water, but now he had to plan his escape. Mark was well aware that NASA's next Eris 4 mission would land on the Shaw-Purley crater exactly 4 years from now. But the problem was that it was approximately 3,200 kilometers from his current location. Now, his only way to escape Mars alive was to somehow reach that location 4 years later. Mark calculated that it would take him about 50 days to reach there. He immediately began his preparations. He had a rover that was in no working condition. However, Mark used his scientific mind. He removed the necessary parts from the damaged rover and fitted them to another working rover. After this modification, his rover was now capable of traveling such long distances. But now he faced a new problem. Mars can be freezing cold at night. To solve this problem, Mark dug out the nuclear battery that his team had buried upon arriving on Mars. Because if the battery were accidentally damaged, the radiation it would emit would send anyone exposed to it straight to the afterlife. However, Mark took the risk and carefully hung it on his rower. The heat from the battery alleviated his cold. Meanwhile, on Earth, NASA began efforts to save Mark. He assigned JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, which builds probes and spaceships for NASA, the daunting task of building the probe within 3 months. JPL Director Bruce and his entire team were now under immense pressure. Normally, a probe takes at least 6 months to develop as yet, but they didn't have even half that time. NASA's master plan was to use this probe to deliver rations and all the necessary survival supplies to Mark for the next 4 years on the. According to the plan, when the Ares 14 lands on Mars 4 years later, they will rescue Mark and bring him back to Earth. The JPL team worked tirelessly to complete this seemingly impossible mission. Meanwhile, NASA Administrator Teddy Sanders assigned a significant responsibility to communications engineer Mindy. Mindy was now given complete access to monitor Mark's every activity and movement via satellite, ensuring minute-by-minute monitoring. Meanwhile, Mark's hard work had paid off, and his potato crop was now fully ready. Seeing the thriving harvest, Mark's face lit up with joy as the yield had surpassed his expectations. Mark had harvested nearly 400 excellent potatoes. With his wisdom, he set aside the larger potatoes for eating and replanted the smaller ones to grow. Thanks to this clever planning, Mark had secured a permanent food supply on a barren planet like Mars. He no longer feared starvation, but Mark knew full well that unless he found a way to communicate directly with NASA, all his efforts would be in vain. Although this was extremely difficult for Mark to do on a desolate planet like Mars, he persisted and eventually found a way. Wasting no time, Mark boarded his rover and set off on an unknown journey. Mitty and Vincent, who were monitoring his every move via satellite on Earth, were completely confused by this. They couldn't understand where Mark was going after leaving his safe haven, or what was going through his mind. Or what was mind. Mark had been heading in an unknown direction for the past 13 days, leaving the NASA team completely perplexed. No one could understand his plan. But then Vincent's brain lit up. When he tracked Mark's route on a map, everything made sense. Mark was actually heading towards the Pathfinder lander, which NASA had landed on Mars Cydia Planitia in 1986. The original mission of that Pathfinder was to collect vital information about Mars' soil, magnetic properties, and atmosphere and send it to NASA. But in 1997, its battery completely ran out, causing NASA to lose contact with it forever. Since then, it had been lost somewhere in the Martian dust, and Mark had now set out to find it, believing it to be his last hope. Vincent's guess turned out to be absolutely correct. Mark recovered the Pathfinder buried in the sand and brought it to his hub. But contact was only possible if NASA had an identical model. Realizing this, Vincent immediately rushed to JPL in California, where a second model of the Pathfinder was stored. He also called all the retired scientists who had worked on that mission. In 1997, efforts to revive the old system began on both sides. Mark, on the other hand, removed the Pathfinder's old battery and connected it to the hub's power source. Luckily, the Pathfinder started working. As soon as Mark turned its antenna towards Earth, the model at JPL immediately received a signal. After years, the old lander had started responding again. Kapoor was overjoyed to see this. However, the actual control of the Pathfinder was with JPL technician Tim. Tim immediately sent a command to turn on the Pathfinder's camera, activating Mark's camera on Mars. Seeing the camera move, Mark knew his efforts had paid off. Someone was trying to contact him. Without delay, Mark wrote a question on a board and held it up to the camera. Is anyone receiving my signal, Ali? He placed a sign with yes on one side and no on the other. As soon as Vincent's team saw the question, they immediately turned the camera to yes. Mark was overjoyed to see his camera on Mars pointing to yes. He felt confident that he was no longer alone. But communicating with Vincent was still difficult. Because of the distance between Earth and Mars, it took about an hour for a question to reach Vincent, and for Vincent to respond. Furthermore, only Mark could ask Vincent questions, and that too in a yes or no, as Vincent had no way of communicating with him. Mark put his scientific mind to work. Mark knew that the part finder's camera could rotate 36 degrees, a full circle. Therefore, Mark chose the hexadecimal number system. Hexadecimal numbers can be converted into ASCII code to form words. Meanwhile, Vincent's team also began communicating with Mark by placing hexadecimal symbols around the Pathfinder. However, because this method was too slow, NASA scientists sent Mark some code that allowed Mark to connect his roar to the part finder and communicate via text messages. NASA sent Mark a message informing him that they had launched a rescue mission and were going to send essential supplies to him first. To him, Mark was overjoyed upon reading this message, and now he saw hope for survival. When Mark asked NASA if his team knew he was alive, NASA replied no, which angered Mark. Now that NASA had contacted Mark, he decided to share the news with the crew. Mark's team was shocked to hear this. While they were happy to see him alive, they also regretted leaving him alone. During this time, he constantly sent NASA updates on his condition and that of his hab. Everything was going well. Mark's potato crop was also doing well. But one night, a terrible accident occurred. Due to repeated use, the airlock could not withstand the pressure and exploded with a loud bang. Demang. Mark was thrown away, puncturing his helmet. Mark immediately sealed the hole with tape. But when he got inside the hab, the deadly cold of Mars had wiped out his entire crop and the essential bacteria in the soil. Now farming there again was impossible. Mark became deeply saddened. His remaining food only lasted for a few hundred days. On Earth, NASA prepared to send a supply mission to the Route D. But the hastily constructed rocket exploded shortly after launch, shattering Mark's last hope. He sent a message to Commander Luce, telling him that if he died, he should tell his parents that there was a greater and nobler purpose behind their son's death. However, Mark hadn't given up yet. Instead, he was preparing himself for any eventuality. Meanwhile, on Earth, the chief scientist and deputy chief scientist of the Chinese Space Agency were watching the news of Mark's failed rescue mission on TV. Then, out of humanitarian concern, the Chinese Space Agency extended a helping hand and decided to donate one of its ready-made booster rockets to NASA. NASA had another chance. But now comes Rich Burnell, a genius, but slightly sane astrodynamicist at NASA. He devised a crazy but brilliant plan called the Rich Burnell Maneuver. The plan was to use Earth's gravity to catapult the Hermes spacecraft back toward Mars instead of landing it on Earth. It was a very risky plan, and the NASA director rejected it. But mission director Mitch secretly relayed the plan to harm his team. The team had to make a decision, either return home safely or risk their lives to save their friend, embarking on another journey of over 500 days. Without a second thought, the entire team decided to go to rescue Mark. Mark had to do his part. He had to travel 50 days subsisting on raw potatoes and even calling himself a space pilot because he was moving towards the MAVAV on his own. Wherever Mark went on Mars, he would become the first human to set foot there. This passion kept Mark's morale at bay. Finally, Mark reached the MAV. However, the MAV had to be light enough to reach orbit. That's why NASA asked him to remove the MAV's Windows control panel and even its nose cone. Basically, Mark was to fly in an open-top convertible rocket covered only by a tarp. Meanwhile, Hermes had already reached Mars orbit. Mark launched the MAV. During launch, the MAV's speed was so high that the tarp ripped, knocking Mark unconscious. Although Mark's MAV separated from the rocket and began orbiting Mars, unfortunately, it was 68 kilometers away from Hermes, making it impossible for Lucas Calamus to bring Mark to his ship. Lewis then instructed Marty to start Hermes' engine, and using the thrusters, they brought Hermes as close to the MAV as possible. But Mark remained unconscious in the MAV. When Mark regained consciousness, Lewis and his team were overjoyed to hear his voice. However, the difference in the speed of Mark's MAV and Hermes' rotation was 42 meters per second, making it impossible to bring Mark to Hermes. Only if they reduced Hermes' rotation speed to approximately the speed of the MAV could they capture Mark and bring him aboard. But they couldn't restart Hermes' engines to do that, as they wouldn't have enough fuel left to return to Earth. To catch him, Commander Lewis devised another crazy plan. He detonated a small bomb in the spaceship's airlock to adjust its speed. Still, there was still some distance left. Then Mark made his final move. He cut a small hole in his spacesuit glove and, using the air pressure, flew towards Hermes like Iron Man. Yeah. Commander Lewis reached out to grab him with the help of a rope. For a moment, it seemed she wouldn't be able to catch him. But Mark grabbed the rope, and finally he was pulled inside the spaceship. This news brought joy to NASA and the entire world. After so many months trapped alone on Mars, Mark Watney was back home to his friend. His first day on Earth was the beginning of a new life for Mark. Now he trains astronauts for NASA and inspires them with stories of his struggle. And that's where the story ends. Friends, if you liked the video, please let us know by liking and commenting. See you in the next video.